But here in Bermuda, we know we've erected barriers that prevent some of the people working in our industries from spending money in Bermuda. Because they are non-Bermudians, there's restrictions on what they can do in terms of investment. They're limited as to how much they can own in a local company because of the 60-40 rule. They're limited as to what real estate they buy. So we know that a large part of the higher income in international business goes to expatriate workers. They can't spend it here in Bermuda. They obviously do spend some, but they don't spend and they don't invest for their retirement. That goes overseas. So when I look at it, I tend to take out just arbitrarily the financial services sector. So Bermuda's GDP used to be recorded at 6 billion. I used to believe it was closer to 3.5 to 4 billion. So to me, I'm always a little bit cautious when we look at ratios and do international comparisons. 3 years ago in the Cayman Islands, some external economists reached the same conclusion, that sure enough, a straight debt comparison at the 24% we've just been quoted is accurate, it's real. But for smaller countries with a small and narrow financial base, it's probably not right to compare it to a very mature country like Canada or Italy or the UK. I hope that answers the question.
Peter, thank you. Madam Premier, can we have your thoughts on the topic?
Number of points to make. I think notwithstanding the revision or the approach taken by different economists about GDP, most economists would use that in terms of the debt to GDP ratio as a rational way of looking at a country's sustainability model. I think that while we certainly don't want to be in the position of Ireland or Greece, where you have about 100% in terms of debt to GDP, neither do we want to be in Barbados' situation where you have about 53%. Cayman is, I think, about 1% above us at about 25. But I think what you've got to do is look at the position as to where you are with debt and whether you believe there is an affordable and a sensible proposal to reduce debt. In Bermuda, we have about 2 senior notes that will come available in 2014, and we're on track. I think one's for 75 million and one maybe for 45 million. We're on track to pay that down at that time. You also will note that we're putting into the sinking fund about 30 million this year. We're also taking us out for debt interest, which is certainly under the statutory legislation for the use of the sinking fund. That's going to be used. We're going to be using some to pay some of the debt interest. So the question is, do we have a sustainable model? And do we also have a rational plan? And I think on both fronts, the answer would be yes. Also, let's talk about, for context, what the position was in 1999 when we took over in 1998. You had debt at that time of about $348 million. And certainly we were on track in the years preceding the recession in terms of how we spent the money. And the money, really, you were using your current account surpluses and the fact that the former Minister of Finance introduced some land tax legislation, so that gave us a windfall which we were able to use for capital expenditure without having to borrow. Subsequent to the economic downturn, we certainly have increased our debt tremendously from the 348 or 358 we inherited to about 900 million plus. But I think you also have to look at where you've spent the money, and notwithstanding some of the excesses on some capital projects, which may have been 20 million, sometimes 15 million, generally if you look at it from a comprehensive point of view, you'll see we've invested in terms of hard core assets, which are going to be for the benefit not just for this generation but for generations to come. So it's very important to always look at it in context, but it's also important to have a plan. And that's why I spoke earlier about the medium-term economic framework and the fact that we are looking at the spending and keeping spending down for the next foreseeable future at the levels that it is, and also seeking to generate additional revenue. Whether you're talking about international fishing, whether you're talking about satellites, or whether you're talking about the airport. And the issue of how you can maximize, I don't know whether you talk about privatization or public-private partnerships in terms of ways so that you leverage the services and the assets of government so that we can take more off our balance sheet. And that's what we always will continue to be mindful of. Thank you.
Thank you. A follow-on question with regard to the debt. If the economic picture looks identical in 12 months' time, what does the panel think about continuing to service the interest on debt from the sinking fund? Peter, would you feel comfortable to give a view on your view?
Sure. The sinking fund is purely an accounting piece. It's a requirement of law that was introduced, and it's segregating money for repayment of debt. So it's like a savings account, and you need to make your mortgage repayments. So whether you're paying interest or principal is slightly neither here nor there. The fact of the matter is, if you take money out, it will go down. As the Finance Minister and Premier has just said, we do have two principal notes which are due for repayment in 2014. My notes tell me we also have the 200 million to repay to the Bank of Butterfield, the 3-year borrowing. But there's a finite limit because it's only money we put into the sinking fund which is available. So in the longer term, is it sustainable? No, because we do have additional debt repayments in future years which we're unlikely to be able to fund from our current revenues. So in other words, Bermuda will become like many of the other countries and will have a debt management program because it will be reissuing debt to replace existing debt. And that's obviously a huge industry in the US, the UK, and other countries. Here in Bermuda, it's never been an issue, but perhaps that's something that the private sector can get together with government and the unions to work out in a non-confrontational way, the most effective way for Bermuda to manage that process, to reduce the average cost, to take the political heat out of it, and to put Bermuda in a firmer footing. Because my view of the developed world, of the US, Canada, Europe, is that in 3 to 5 years' time, those governments will have enormous problems borrowing money. And we, Bermuda, are too small to be able to get to the front of the queue. So I think the window of opportunity is now in the next year to 18 months to put in place a good platform so that Bermuda can fund its debts for the next 10 years whilst we turn the economy around and eventually start repaying them. Thank you.
I think really it's just to amplify what I said earlier. I think clearly you have to have a sustainable model. The sustainable model has to be based on generating new revenue, not just your existing tax base, but expanding it. That's why you look at other means of diversification. That's why I said, and you've referenced, and I've referenced in the budget statement, some of the options there. The other issue is also that discussions already are ongoing as to other sources, even in terms of the backstop for the Bermuda government. But I think clearly you have to look at replacement revenue and increasing revenue. But you don't look at it in terms of levying it at a time of hardship. But I think it's common sense, really, that you've got to look for additional revenue, and we've signposted some already.
Right, moving away from the deficit for a moment into other parts of the income statement there. A couple of questions here. Do you believe that contracting the economy is going to be the result of restricting work permits? Wayne, could you take that one?
Can you repeat the question, please? I'm just playing.
Will the economy be contracted by restricting work permits?